All right. Hey, Paul, Joe is not with us tonight, but he had the story that I wanted to talk about. It's relevant. It's a kind of a religious publication, but they talk a lot about pop culture. They do some interesting stuff, and they're talking about why we like nostalgia. And my goodness, I'm all about the nostalgia. I don't watch as much current TV. I'm stuck on The Office and Frasier and all the other stuff. Um, it kind of interesting. There's a story kind of just speculating on why we do this. They say we're longing for a past we associate with positive feelings. Sometimes, like if you hear a song from your high school days or you go back to your childhood hometown, it gives you emotions you can't explain. And they say this emotional pull is more than just a temporary feeling. I know it provides you comfort and security. I can agree with that.
I, yeah, but is this where it gets into rewatching or what?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the thought is like, why are we drawn back to these shows? So, like, if we
I,
look at The Office, we've probably seen The Office a lot. So, there's 100
yeah, I
more
mean,
shows out there. Why do we keep
I, I
going
don't
back
think
to these
for
shows?
I don't think for me there's a nostalgia about The Office as like to a period in my life as much as it's just a great show. Um,
Right.
there are, I mean, there's songs that obviously remind me of high school or something, but if I don't like the song just as a song, then it's not going to do anything. I mean, yeah, I think there's nothing wrong with the nostalgia, but I don't think just because you rewatch or re-listen to a song, it's not always just about trying, longing for days gone by. Sometimes it's just something that you really like.
Well, think when COVID first started, like, we had a time where nothing new was coming out. It was weird. Like, ESPN would show old games, and you think about ESPN Classic, but ESPN turned into ESPN Classic. And I think people like that because we were so freaked out of just the fears of what could happen with COVID that you kind of you wanted to escape to another time in some ways where you're like, all right, I want to turn the TV on and have to watch the latest, story about what's happened with COVID or some of the crap, like some of the people who are spreading misinformation about COVID were out there, and you're like, enough. I want to escape a little bit. I don't know, but think about your parents too. Like, your parents might be into like the 50s and 60s. Like, my dad really was never a pop culture type guy, but he loved baseball. He could tell me everything about like the baseball stars in the 50s and 60s. And sometimes, like, you roll your eyes like, come on, Dad, it's a little too much. But man, I can tell you a lot more about the baseball stars of the 90s than the stars today. So I'm sure some young guy listening to me is like, man, this guy is kind of in the past.
But I think there with that you've got. I mean, you said the '90s. I mean, you're high school into college and in your early 20s, and you're kind of a carefree and just life was simpler. Where now, it's harder to know every player on every team and all their stats like you did before because you got a mortgage to pay and you got to make sure that the bill and you got to do the housework and just other responsibilities and that sometimes there's you know it feels good to go back and remember those times when things were simpler for you or you felt more yourself. But I think for me with nostalgia, and you mentioned like our parents were of the age where they were just really loved the 50s or 60s, and I think the problem for me comes when you freeze yourself there. Like we could freeze ourselves in the 80s or 90s
Right.
and just refuse like oh that was best TV, best movies, best everything, nothing will ever be the same, and just um, it's okay to appreciate the good things from them, but still embracing the good things of now. It's kind of like that 40-year-old guy who peaked in high school and he's 40 and he still is like basing his identity by the fact that he was the starting quarterback in high school. Like, dude, you're 40, nobody cares anymore.
The
Um,
Al Bundy effect.
so I mean, it's great to look back with fond memories of when you were younger and carefree, but and maybe listen to songs that remind you of that, but don't get stuck there. I mean, there's just because you were a kid back then doesn't mean that music today is worse. Or the people who say that baseball players are so much better back then. No, they were not. They were all out of shape and smoking cigars in the dugout. And
Yeah, I agree with you. Like, and I don't. It wasn't even the '90s. It was like the '80s. Like I used to memorize like baseball players in the '80s. I have
because you
a
had nothing else going on.
yeah. Like I have a computer game. I'll have to show you sometime. You probably never want to talk to me again. It's really nerdy, but the thing I like about it is you can play old seasons and stuff. It's like now if you go to the store and buy a new video game, they just have the current season. But if you wanted to play old seasons, you play this video game, and man, like I would play 1986. Where I'm like, oh, I remember the Indians from back then. Where now I could probably tell you four guys on the current Cleveland Guardians team. So yeah, and you're. I think what you just said hits the nail on the head. I mean, back in the '80s, I was 10. I had time to memorize
Yeah, and
baseball. Now,
when you were 10 and watching a baseball team, I mean those guys were larger than life. I mean, those were like almost I don't want to say idolized, but those were like meeting a pro athlete.
well,
That was
this is how.
everything. Whereas now it's like, just some kids.
Well, we memorized Bible verses too, but my brother and I would literally sit there and say, all right, we're going to memorize the starting lineups for the past 3 years for all the baseball teams. And it's like, why would you do that? But what really struck me how my life changed was I was editing a newspaper in Gallion at the time. And one of the guys that graduated from that school, it's a school in Western Ohio, um, made the big. And he was playing for the Chicago White Sox. So they're up in Cleveland. They're playing the Indians at the time. So I got press pass to get to the game. I arranged to interview this player, and he was a backup outfielder. You probably wouldn't recognize the name, but it was funny. So the PR guy said, all right, meet me, and I'll take you in the locker room, and we'll get him, and you can talk to him before the game. So we did that. It was fun. But I remember I was waiting in the middle of the locker room because he was talking to some of his friends on the team. So I just sat there in the locker room. I kind of looked around at the what do you call it, the placards at the locker room just to say, all right, here's the Chicago White Sox. Let me see who I recognize. This was like 10 years ago. I recognized one guy on the team. You know what I mean? Where 20 years ago, I looked around going, oh my goodness, these are all my heroes. And now I'm like, man, I don't recognize them.
I mean, I can look back to '80s Cleveland teams of I remember Rick Manning, Corey Snyder, Jerry Dubzinski, Dwayne Kuiper, Toby Harrah, Mike. I mean, I could go through all of these guys because I was a kid. I had nothing to do,
Yeah.
so I watched 5 baseball games a week because I had nothing to do.
Here's the shame of it. And I remember who were joking. Was it like Richie at like an old Indians pitcher? We need to have more old baseball players on this show. That'd be fun. Problem is, like, you and me are probably the only guys that would know who Richie Yet is. So it's probably not good to grow a podcast because all these random dudes on there. But hey, it'll make us happy. Maybe that's what we need to do. So yeah, let's
Call Ron Hassey, see what he's doing.
Ron Hesse. I remember in high school, me and this guy, a friend of mine, his name was Chris Davis. We got all excited because the Indians catcher, and he wasn't even the catcher at that time. He was kind of like old school back then. There was a guy named Chris Bando who was this random
Yep.
catcher for the Indians, and we all laughed because I was Chris and he's Chris, and it's a random Chris Bando. And those were fun days. But again, that's when we had time to pay attention to these guys. Where now I'm not sure I can tell you one catch on the Guardians. So we miss those days. So
Austin Hedges.
let's know what you think about nostalgia. Do you like nostalgia? What's your favorite part of it? Give us a like, subscribe, and share us with your friends as well. Have a great day, everybody.